The purpose of this conversation is really to recognize that big business has had has been responsible in many ways, both to driving malnutrition and also to food waste. But it also has the power to make change. And together with many stakeholders and civil society, building together a coalition to really look at ways that we can make real systemic change so that everybody will actually get their right to nutrition, which is going to allow everybody to thrive and to live. So enough for me, and let's start this conversation. I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank both of our speakers for being here with us today. It is an incredible honor to have these two people with us. So to get the conversation started, Lawrence, you've been focused on how to reduce malnutrition for decades, and you have been with GAIN now since 2016. Can you give us a sense of the scale of the problem and how GAIN is working to bring quality nutrition to those most in need?
Thank you, Atlantic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us. We're honored to be here. It's a delight, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. So the numbers are really, really sobering. The number that I focus on and that GAIN tends to focus on is this number of 3 billion. 3 billion people worldwide cannot afford a healthy diet. Just let that sink in. 3 billion people worldwide can't afford a healthy diet. 1 billion of those 3 billion are in Africa. That's 3/4 of the population in Africa cannot afford a healthy diet. And that's going to get worse before it gets better. The price of nutritious foods, things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, pulses, beans, eggs, dairy, these prices are going up relative to cereals. And the impacts are really lifelong. They're not, we're talking a lot in the COVID era about economies bouncing back and building back better. But very young kids under the age of 2, they just won't be able to bounce back better. The impacts for them are lifelong unless we can reverse them within the first 2 years of life. We just did some work published in The Lancet a couple of months ago that shows the number of wasted children. These are children under the age of 5 who are very thin. Those numbers are going to go up by 7 million in the 9 months since March. Just to give you some context, it took 9 years to get those numbers down by 7 million. So 9 years to get the numbers down, 9 months they go back up. So what's GAIN doing about it? We're a nonprofit, as you said, and our goal is to really improve the consumption of nutritious food for all. And we do this by linking food systems to nutrition outcomes. Food systems is everything, every decision that's made from what land to use, what crops to produce, how to process them, how to transport them, how to store them, how to market them, how to buy them, how to eat them, how to prepare them. All of those decisions, those hundreds of decisions, they all have consequences for nutrition. So what can we do to incentivize, to nudge, to change those decisions so they generate maximum nutrition? And we do it by linking the public sector to the private sector, because we believe that the private sector is, yes, a part of the problem, but it has to be a part of the solution. And we do it through policy work and program work. Give me 2 very quick examples. Policy work in India. In India, we are on the verge, the Indian government is on the verge of making it mandatory to fortify all edible oil, all cooking oil, and all dairy with vitamin A and vitamin D. This is momentous. Hundreds of millions of people are about to get vitamin A and vitamin D in their staple foods that we in Europe and North America take for granted. And GAIN had a role to play in that, and I'm very proud of that work. Our program work in actually working with Unilever in Kenya and elsewhere, helping workers on tea estates, tea pickers and tea estates to get access to nutritious food in the workforce. And now we're working with the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a big business network of consumer goods companies, to get them to commit, to get their members to commit to workforce nutrition programs in all of their headquarters and in their value chains, promoting things like breastfeeding for women. So that's what we do at Atlanti. We do it in different countries, and we do it often. We concentrate all of our work in a number of countries. We do it because we feel that no one else is really doing this. No one else is bringing the public and the private together to improve access of the very poorest to nutritious foods. Over.
Lawrence, could you say a few words also, because I've just been reading a lot around the first 1,000 days and the impact of malnutrition. I think people aren't aware how the effect of those first 1,000 days, both in terms of future economic ability to make money, etc. I think you could say a few words about that. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, think about, listeners, think about a human brain. A human brain at birth weighs 1 pound. At the end of the first year of life, that brain weighs 2 pounds. And for adults, a typical human brain weighs 3 pounds. So it's going from 1 pound at birth to 2 pounds at 1 year of age to 3 pounds as adults. So you can figure out how quickly that brain is developing in the womb in the first 2 years of life. Anything that disrupts that, poor diets, poor health, poor dirty water, poor sanitation, anything that disrupts that, it's like messing around with concrete that is drying. That disruption is set in stone, is set in concrete after the first two years of life. And it has massive consequences in terms of the ability to learn in school, the ability of immune systems to repel infection, the ability of people to escape poverty later on. Even it makes them more susceptible to obesity and diabetes type 2 later in life. So if you miss that window of opportunity, that first 1,000 days, we're really consigning children to a life of unfulfilled potential.
Thank you for the Paul Lever. What were you trying to achieve? What was your mission, and how did you go about achieving it? How can big business
stunting alone 160 million children, sub-Sahara Africa, costing them 10 to 12% of the GDP. So you can see why that is important, that we all focus on that. I mean, for me, the main driver is, this world can only function if we treat everybody with dignity and respect, if we have equity for everybody, and if we don't leave anybody behind. And it gets to the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And whatever part of society you're in, I ended up in business as a coincidence, but you have to contribute to that. If you make it worse, you're not needed anymore. If you make it better, you're embraced. And I think for business to stay alive, you want to be embraced. You don't want to be rejected. And yet so many businesses still operate under a rejection mode. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the average lifetime of publicly traded companies has gone down from 67 years when I was born to 17 years currently. It takes a skill to run these companies, and one of the skills is to be sure that you have a positive contribution. I also applaud GAIN for the new gender strategy. I was looking at that, has been an incredibly important part for us in Unilever to get gender equality across the value chain. And part of that is the programs we did with smallholder farmers and the livelihoods that we created. And you can only do that if you work together with organizations like GAIN that are on the ground and understand the specific issues in each of the countries. So for Unilever, I think we firmly shifted the company to a strategy that we would call sustainable living over the period 2010 to 2019, my 10 years as CEO. And it really was making Unilever a purpose-driven company is not so surprising. That if you want to be around, you want to respect the environment, you want to build more inclusive business models, and you want to ensure that human growth and development, planetary boundaries, and the sustainability of companies themselves go hand in hand. And that's why we initiated the Sustainable Living Plan at that point in time. A very audacious plan, perhaps 10, 12 years ago, because there wasn't enough data available. I think now people are more and more convinced why that is absolutely needed. We put 3 big targets out there to not surprisingly decouple growth from our environmental impact. This year alone, Earth's Overshoot Day is August 22nd, which means every day after we're basically stealing from future generations, using more resources than the planet can replenish. So circular economies are not enough anymore. It has to be regenerative if you want to. So this decoupling I saw as absolutely important to do. The second target was to ensure that we would reach 1 billion people, improving their health and well-being. And we did that with a gender lens to be sure that we covered both parts. And then finally, improving livelihoods for 5 million people. We said that, and that was mainly oriented towards smallholder farmers at that time. And again, with programs with many organizations to ensure that that was gender balanced as well. I firmly believe that for companies to be around longer term, you cannot be anymore in the CSR mode or less bad. You really have to change your business model to be net positive, and companies that do well. Colin Meyer in his book Prosperity talks about purpose and purpose-driven organizations, and he defines it as to profitably address the issues of people and planet, and that's really what we're trying to do. Not surprisingly, when you do that and you can do that successfully, you benefit from that. People with purpose thrive. We saw the same in Unilever. We became the most desired employer in most countries we operated in. 2 million people applying. The third most looked up company on LinkedIn after Google and Apple. It was a very high engagement score in the company. And especially the younger people are more purpose driven. Brands with purpose grow. All of our brands that were attacking these deeper issues. You take Knorr, for example, putting iodine in to deal with the issues of anemia and some of the things that Lawrence was referring to, now getting into the law in India, were just quite normal for us. And what we found was that the brands with a stronger purpose were not only growing faster, but they were also more profitable. And then not surprisingly, companies with purpose last. I already alluded to that. But if you run your company short-term with a myopic focus on the shareholder, it's not going to be successful long-term. You have to optimize, not maximize, optimize your multiple stakeholders. So that's what we did in Unilever. It served us well. It set a strategic direction for the company. It defined the culture for the company. And it also made us obviously think more robustly about the brands and the businesses that we wanted to be in. Since then, it's become a little bit easier, I think. In the last few years, we've now gotten overwhelming data from the market that more gender balanced organizations do better. Organizations that internalize the challenges of climate change do better. Organizations that are more purpose driven do better. And what you see with COVID as a good example is that the companies that are run under ESG, environmental, social, and governance, are not only able to better navigate the challenging markets that are out there, but actually the funds that the financial market has invested in also are giving consistently now higher returns. So we're on to something. And I think COVID has shown us above anything, like Lawrence is saying, that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And we now just need to be sure that we learn from these mistakes that we've made that got us to this point, and that we design individually and collectively something better as we get out of this.
Listening to you, Paul, the problems that you had to face, I mean, how do you manage 5 million rural farmers? How do you actually do that to be part of a supply chain which is so global? Can you just give me a few words about that? Well,
it's you set yourself the objective. Obviously, it is easy let's take tea. Lawrence was talking about tea and the programs we have in Tanzania and Kenya around smallholder farmer livelihoods. But the reason I like tea and actually built tea plantations and bought the tea companies is because if you have 2 acres, it's a hand picking business. If you have 2 acres, you can make a livelihood. Sure, it's easier for us to buy on the bulk on the open market and go to the auctions and try to get the best price. But I figured that ultimately a company cannot outsource its supply chain and also outsource its responsibilities. So for me, what was attractive for tea was actually to ensure that we could give these people livelihoods, send their kids to school. So we started operating schools and hospitals, and these tea plantations have 50 to 100,000 people there. So you can see that it's like running a city. And if you manage the 2 acres well and do sustainable agriculture, water management, give them drought-resistant bushes, etc., they actually can make a decent livelihood. And then you invest in the tea plantations and solar and clean cooking stoves, hygiene, the wash programs, and all the other things. And you can actually quite significantly change communities if you want to. So selling the tea for me was a means to an end. And the challenge was more to figure out how to make it work for everybody. But over time, I believe people want to know where their products come from. People want to know if you're in your value chain as slave labor or child labor or people that live well below the minimum wage. 4.5 billion people in this world still living below $5 a day. And if we don't want our children to be in that situation, I think whatever position you're in my case, the CEO of a company, then you have to do something about it and try to correct it. And what we found was, if you look at the whole ecosystem, your productivity goes up, your pride goes up, your quality goes up, and it's very well doable. Unilever over those 10 years had a 300% shareholder return, so we haven't short-circuited anybody. Now it's difficult to deal with all the smallholder farmers by themselves because we simply wouldn't have that capacity. So when we built a new tea plantation, for example, in Rwanda, we would go together with an NGO, Ian Wood in this case, or we go together with IDH, which is a Dutch organization, or with GAIN and others that we form these alliances, often linked with governments, DFID or USAID and others. And it's by forming these partnerships that allow you not only to reach 1 or 2 billion more people down in the value chain to the bottom of the pyramid, but these partnerships also keep you honest and make these programs more robust, so that if there's a change of management or the direction of the wind is blowing differently or there are some other things, it's so firmly embedded into your operating model that you cannot really change that quickly. And that's important, because the issue with farmers and smallholder farmers especially is that the current system is unfortunately stacked against them, and they always get the wrong end of the stick. And as was said before, it's especially the women that suffer disproportionately from that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, and what you said is very interesting. The fact that when you left Unilever, I think everybody thought, okay, are they going to continue? But those partnerships, as you said, must have been a real guarantee of ensuring that it had become a systemic change in that organization. Very interesting. Change is slow, however, and there are constant challenges on the way. And this is to both of you. For both of you, what were the greatest challenges, barriers, and how did you overcome them? I'll go back to Lawrence and then come back to Paul. Lawrence.
Thank you, Atlante. I think the biggest barrier really to GAIN's work and to work like GAIN's is this big aversion that the public sector has to the private sector when it comes to food and nutrition. We've taken kind of a three-pronged approach to dealing with that. First, we sort of outline the motives, some of the things that Paul was talking about for partnership. Then we try to create the opportunities for that. And then we try to generate the means for doing that. So quickly, on the motives, we have to convince the public sector skeptics about business that we have to remind them that most low-income people buy food from markets, from small and medium enterprises. There's a romantic notion that most people in low-income contexts grow their own food. They don't. Nearly everyone is a net purchaser of food. They buy food from markets. And if they do that, they're engaging with business. So to say I'm not going to engage with business is frankly irresponsible. But we also have to convince the private sector skeptics that a purpose-driven approach, such as Paul has pioneered with Unilever, really can help their bottom line, their commercial bottom line. And the evidence is really growing. Rigorous evidence is growing to show that companies that have an authentic, purpose-driven focus retain employees, attract better employees, have higher productivity, less absenteeism, and they're rewarded for this commercially by consumers who are waking up to the fact, as Paul said, about where their food comes from and how it's produced and how it's sold. Authenticity is really beginning to pay off in the market. And then finally, we have to convince both public and private that risks can be managed. And you do this by appealing to evidence, making sure that everything's transparent and it's evidence driven, and keeping an eye on the prize. You know, the prize is, will this partnership, does it stand a chance of advancing nutrition? And if it does, you have to try it. I mean, kids can't eat ideology, so you have to try it. So that's the motives. On the opportunities, we work very hard at GAIN to create opportunities for public and private to come together. I'll talk a bit later, if I have time, Atalanti, about the nutritious food financing facility, which helps investors invest in small and medium enterprises in Africa that are producing nutritious food. But we have this fantastic program in Bangladesh that I wanted to quickly tell you about. It's called the Pocket Money Pledge. A youth foundation, a national youth foundation in Bangladesh came to us about 3 years ago and said, look, we have adolescents, we have membership of adolescents in the millions from all over Bangladesh, but everywhere outside of their schools, they're being sold cheap junk food. It's high in salt, sugar, and trans fats. It's really unhealthy, but it's really cheap and it's really tasty. What can we do? So we said, well, let's ask your adolescents what we can do. And the adolescents quickly said, look, we've got pocket money. It's not much, it's a few pennies a day. But if we somehow find a way of aggregating that, we can put pressure on governments to do more, and we can put pressure on businesses to do more. So we just devised with the adolescents this thing called a Pocket Money Pledge. And we now have 1 million adolescents in Bangladesh who've signed this pledge. And we can now go to government and say, look at this latent demand for healthy foods. What are you going to do to help the adolescents? They are future leaders, future parents, future entrepreneurs, and future voters. What are you going to do to help them? And we can go to businesses too and say, look at this. Here's a ready-made customer base for you for the next 50 years. What are you going to do to meet their demands? And finally, we focus on means. That was the motive and the opportunity. Well, how do we make it easier for everybody to do this? And we run about 16 or 17 business networks, small business networks in the countries we work in that are really help small businesses come together that are interested in doing more for nutrition. A great many of them are women-led entrepreneurs. And we essentially help them figure out how to engage with governments, how to learn from each other, and how to connect to finance. One of the things we do for governments also, because governments have a big responsibility here, we've developed this thing called the Ease of Doing Business Index for nutrition, because very often governments do things that are not helpful for businesses that want to do more for nutrition, especially small businesses. And they don't do it knowingly, they do it unwittingly. So we've developed a 20 question index using existing data that just helps them understand what they could do more of to help smaller businesses produce more of the things that we know are so important for diets: vegetables, fruits, eggs, dairy, pulses, and so on. So that's the challenge. It's this meta challenge. It's challenging narratives around business. Business is either bad, the devil, or an angel. Well, the reality is in between. There are businesses that we want to work with, and there are businesses that we don't. And we just have to figure out which are the ones we want to work with and how to do that.
Yeah, but what was so interesting about what you were saying also is that we cannot do it alone. We have to talk to government, we have to talk to business, we have to talk to the youth. So it's a really multi-stakeholder action. And I think what's important is what we're doing today is bringing to a broader public the real urgency of this, and that we can all have a role in making change. Paul, I'm coming to you to ask you for your challenges and your opportunities.
Well, I think it's the same. I won't repeat it, but the challenges that are out there now that need to be addressed, of climate change, of food security, of poverty, of deforestation, and the list goes on, water accessibility, are of such magnitude that nobody can do it alone. And the reality is we're going through a little bit of a deep point on global governance. And if that is the case, then actually the other parties, if you want to, civil society, the private sector, have to step up more. And in any part, you see people that are self-serving and fortunately enough that really want to drive the changes. And I found out that it doesn't need much. It just needs the right people to create these tipping points, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the reality is most of the big change efforts fail. There are very few that actually succeed. And the reason is that often you don't spend enough time in the beginning to create a trust, to align the objectives, to understand where the added value is of each of them, to hold everybody accountable, and to operate with a high level of transparency, etc. And we've learned that same in Unilever, that you know, despite all the efforts that we did to work together with many, it's probably only a half or less than half that actually succeed. And these are always the best practices, at least from companies like ours. Now, the reality is that CEOs nowadays are held to much higher standards than they can deliver on themselves. I believe that CEOs, even the best ones in the world, can only do 40–50% of the things that they are being asked for by themselves, to solve the issues of plastics in the oceans, or to move to regenerative cotton or agriculture, or to take slave labor or child labor out of your value chain. You know, even the biggest companies in the world would not be able to achieve that. So the first part of partnership is really bringing companies together and working across your value chain. But even then you might only be able to do 60–70%. So ultimately you need to work with governments and get the frameworks and the policies that are right in place to do that. And there are many examples, obviously, where that can be done and where that is being done. Recycling would be one of the things. The climate actions that you see now taking momentum, the whole area of circularity or the European green economy packages are examples of that have come to fruition by these partnerships. The reason I've created Imagine is exactly for that reason, to bring about a big enough group of CEOs across the value chain that are committed, that want to change. And I find that if you bring about 25 or 30% of the value chain together, you can actually create the tipping points. Lawrence was talking about nutrition and nutritional labeling. Every company has an opinion about that, and probably for good reason. But if you put a group like that together, then you can get probably quicker consensus. And that's exactly what we're now doing with Europe and the Green Deal behind the Nutri-labeling. And that is probably a better solution to do it all together than to wait for it to come from government, which often might not have all the knowledge either to do that properly and reflect what the needs are of society. The two biggest challenges right now are fairly big, but attackable. The first one is that we have a problem with global governance, and most of these changes need a global approach to attack. Our institutions aren't functioning. The governments that we have elected, not to blame themselves, but they are clearly more focused on nationalism and populism and shrinking to their own territories than actually cooperating. And COVID has probably shown the low deep end of that, if I may be honest. And so we do need to get the governments to put this firmly onto their policies, and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, are probably the two most important things that we need to continue to refer to and to drive. The second challenge is really our economic system, where the financial markets are short-term, where we only measure financial capital And unless we start measuring also environmental and social capital, will we be able to address it? Now, fortunately, again, here as well, many efforts happening where the requirements move rapidly into the broader accounting and providing that transparency and accountability. And that's absolutely needed to get a critical mass of the private sector involved. So I would say these are probably the two biggest challenges that at least I'm focused on for the time being.
And they're huge, and they're huge. Yeah. I remember when you spoke about a year ago, you said it was very lonely where you were sitting, but I'm hoping that there are a few more people around you now and making that tipping point of leaders that can make those kind of changes that you're talking about. Yeah.
The crisis helps us probably accelerate it. People really understand now that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And I think we're seeing some momentum. The good news of today, because I like every day a little bit good news, is that Japan, which is the third biggest economy in the world and the fifth biggest emitter, has decided to also be net zero on climate by 2050. So now we have Europe, we have the US, we have Europe, China, Japan, and hopefully in 1 week and 1 day's time, we have the US join.
That's true. Lawrence, you in your work to bring food justice to those who are forgotten, and I think often the ones that are forgotten are women, and the ones that are the most vulnerable are women. Who are the most important allies who made your work possible?
I grew up in East London in a council estate to a single mum with a younger sister. We lived on welfare for 9 years. I got free school meals. So my mother really told me and taught me how strong, determined women can kind of change the world, actually. So that was deeply ingrained into my psyche. My PhD work was all about power relationships within households, but I couldn't get anyone to fund any of it. It all seemed very esoteric to lots of people. And in the end, I got Ford and Rockefeller foundations when I was a very young man to give me the princely sum of $15,000 to do my research. It seemed like a huge amount of money at the time. This was 30 years ago, but it allowed me to do some things. So, you know, you find enablers along the way if you have that mindset. And, you know, that work showed that women eat last and least, but there are also things that you can do about it in terms of policy, legislation, and norm settings. A really powerful ally along the way was UNICEF, actually, and Tony Lake, who was one of their former executive directors, and he ran a one-person crusade early on in his tenure at UNICEF to convince UNICEF programs to reach the poorest. You know, all the UNICEF programmers would say, but it's more expensive to reach the poorest and the more vulnerable, very often disproportionately women. And Tony Lake said, yeah, that's one half of the equation. What about the benefits to doing so? And of course, once the economists got involved and I got involved as well, you could see the benefit cost ratios are much higher, as well as being the right thing to do. It was also the very smart thing to do. So that, again, very, very powerful imprint on how one person in the right position can make a difference. And finally, Atalante, I want to give a shout out to journalists. I spend a lot of time talking to journalists, and good journalists, their role is to highlight issues that others think are not news and not newsworthy. And those are usually issues that affect the poorest in society. So, you know, people like Nick Kristof at New York Times, allafrica.com, NDTV in India, these journalists they're bringing the issues that other people don't want to talk about into the public consciousness. So I think if you have that mindset, you'll find allies along the way. Over.
Yeah, that's really, I'm so happy you brought up the issue of journalists, because I think they've been so maligned along the way. We just had one of our participants is Heba Ali, who runs a New Humanitarian. And she said, I'm a journalist, and you know, their work is amazing. What Thomson Reuters Foundation has done under Monique Villa. I mean, it's true. These people are bringing these issues to the forefront and are tremendous at it. So yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. Paul, what was the most surprising or unexpected opportunity or challenge that you were able to leverage to transform Unilever?
Well, this was, if you are a CEO, and I think with the pace of change that the world is going and the unpredictability, many people call this a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You will get challenges thrown at you continuously. So over my 10 years time, I was more of the mindset of whatever happens to you, turn it into a positive. It's not what is happening, it's actually what you're doing with it that you should focus on. And in that sense, any crisis offers an opportunity. And I'll give you some examples of that. In hindsight, I would say what I would have done differently, probably even Unilever, I would say, was not aggressive enough in its targets and in its modus operandus in the 10 years. If I now see where the world is and the lack of success in convincing others to go into that direction, we cannot give ourselves the medals. We might have been better than the rest, but that's not good enough if we don't solve the ultimate issues. One of the great opportunities is from Jim Collins, from his book From Good to Great, where he says, nurture the core before you stimulate progress. And one of the things that attracted me to Unilever coming in as a CEO from the outside was that the company had very strong values. There was a root there. Lord Lever already talked about shared prosperity, as he called it, when he was running the company, and actually was quite a remarkable man if you dive into his history. So I had enough to go by to rebuild this company, although it had forgotten it over the last decade or so and had fallen prey to shareholder primacy. I could at least leverage some of the core strengths and bring people back to the roots of the company. But my big advantage was perhaps the financial crisis, because although the world globally missed the opportunity to spend enough money behind greening, we spent all the money to save the banking world, but we didn't address the issues of inequality or gender or planetary boundaries. But it at least gave me an opportunity to rally the company coming in from the outside, and that was very good. And then there are many things over your career that happen that make you think and make you change. You know, unfortunately, I was caught in Mumbai in the terrorist attacks, and it made me think a little bit differently about life, about poverty, about things. The Kraft Heinz attempted takeover of Unilever, where two conflicting economic models really came to a head, and that makes you think of things. You know, when the US decides to leave the Paris Accord, you go into overdrive and try to organize the people to step up and compensate for that. The financial markets become shorter term. So there are many things that I think are shocks to our systems that we can blame others for or shrink or feel miserable, but it never leads to anything. So the challenge for all of us is this little mental exercise, not to listening to that little voice that sometimes try to discourage you, but be driven by your stronger values and your stronger purpose to do something about it. And then life is good, and life is actually full of opportunities, and that's what I'm focused on, and increasingly so.
That's a very enlightening, inspiring response that I think all of us just take stock of in many ways, because so often we say, well, what can we do? The task is so big. And yet I really believe that we can all really make a difference. My next question was about women and the smallholder farmers in terms of how can you, as big business, really engage with those small farmers. But you answered it in terms of the tea, the tea production. But when we're talking also, you know, I think Lawrence very rightly said that these rural farmers are often not growing food for themselves, they're growing them for the supply chain. And so how do you ensure that they're being, first of all, paid enough so that they can actually feed their families as good as food as they're growing, etc.? Can you just speak briefly about that for me, please? Thank you.
Well, I think a little bit of a framework of John Ruggies' human rights framework, which talks about rights, skills, and opportunities. You know, women are 60% of the workforce globally, but they only get about 10% of the income. You can't find that as being the same rights. In many countries, women don't have access to education, land rights, or financing. So if we don't fight for the same rights, first and foremost, we will not get there. I had the opportunity to lead the food security task force for the G20 when it was in Los Cabos. And they said, well, put a group of businesses together and give us the recommendations. And thank God we put people together from all parts of life, with UNICEF, the FAO, the OECD, and many others. And it was thanks to people like Oxfam, like Barbara Stocking, that we got into the issues of land rights, for example, or biofuel, issues that business didn't want to attack. So the first thing really is to be sure as businesses that you get the broader coalitions that give you the right overview of what sometimes might be complex issues, but fight for the rights of people. That is very important. And then the second thing is skills. We spend a disproportionate amount of time and effort investing in skills into people. And we found that it was actually very well spent. You know, Lawrence will know that $1 spent on nutrition will give you a $16 return in the economy. There are not many investments that have such a return. And what we've seen is that as far as women is concerned, that if you give women that same opportunity as men, you could unlock the global economy was anywhere between 20 and $25 trillion at a time that we need it most. We also found in agriculture that if we would just give women in Africa alone the opportunities of land rights and fairly treat them, we could bring the number of people that were going to bed hungry down by 200 million. And all of that is directly to the benefit of business. Business doesn't function in these societies that fail either. So investing in these programs for us was very important, be it the nutritional programs I talked about with our products, but also freeing up time by for example, providing them water or making products that require them less to go back and forth to the wells and do other things, but also giving them skills, enormous amounts of time in spent on education and training. And so all these things together, I think, work. One of the bigger programs where we wanted to reach the 500 million is in fact the programs that we worked with GAIN and got others into the coalitions where we were trying to identify the issues of nutrition and brought that back right to the roots, because often they're monocrop farmers, and actually even if their crop is very good, they have to sell it to get whatever income they can get, and often not left with many things behind. Another program, a final one quickly to mention that comes to mind, is, for example, our Shakti programs that Unilever had around the world, where we have about 100,000 women that are being trained, especially in the rural areas, to sell our products. Not only is that a benefit because you do indeed sell a little bit more of your products, but more importantly, you provide livelihoods, you provide dignity, and you create these microeconomies that help develop these communities. And as these communities develop, you'll ultimately be successful as a company as well. So if you don't take these broader responsibilities and look at it holistically, we will never get there. Unfortunately, in the case of Unilever, we had people like C.K. Prahalat advising us, and we had a long history in countries like India where we see these challenges on a daily basis and are able to succeed. And as a result, we operate under a mentality, I think, more than other companies. We really see us as a company that produces for the bottom of the pyramid, but actually works with those people to produce the products that they need. And if you understand that and do that well, it can also be extremely good for companies themselves, whilst you at the same time solve these societal issues.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. This brings us nicely to the question I want to ask Lawrence. You've worked with business, small farmers, international organization, governments. Your nutrition dashboard is taking multi-stakeholder look at the problem of malnutrition. Can you tell us more about it, and what do you see the role of women in the system change solutions? How can we maximize their involvement?
Thanks, Atlantic. Well, the dashboard is really kind of like Google Maps for data. And if you want to understand your food system, go to the food system dashboard. It's a great tool. It'll help you
Amazing.
describe. Sorry?
It's amazing. I've been to it, and I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, it'll help you describe your food system at the national level, diagnose it, and then figure out what to do about it. But Atlanti, if I may just, before we break, can I talk a little bit about my dream?
Yes, no, so we can go to dreams now, and then we'll open up to questions. I think the conversation has been so rich and so full of content. I think it would be nice to dream now. And I'm going to ask Lawrence, you give us your dream, and then we'll ask Paul for his dream. So
my dream, so when I'm an economist, when I applied for the GAIN position 4.5 years ago, I was interviewed by the board, and it's kind of a scary board. And they said to me, so tell us what your ambition is for GAIN, and more importantly for the sector. And I said, well, one of my big heroes is Muhammad Yunus, who's founded Grameen Bank. And he basically showed that the poor were bankable. Up until that point, commercial banks had sort of said, well, if we lend to these guys, we'll never get the money back. So he came up with a model that showed that the poor were bankable. Now, at the time in the interview, I was being a little bit hyperbolic, as Paul knows I can be. But 4 years later, again, and not really much thanks to me, actually, it's more thanks to my fantastic team. I feel like we're on the verge of something similar, proving that small and medium enterprises who produce and supply nutritious food for domestic consumption in low-income settings, I feel like we're on the verge of showing that they are investable, especially women-led entrepreneurs whose talent is often overlooked. How can you discount half of the entrepreneurial talent in the world? You can't. We're developing a model, the Nutritious Food Financing Facility, that has the premise that there's a $200 billion impact investing industry out there. 18 billion of that goes to Africa. 5 billion of that 18 goes to agriculture and food in Africa. And we estimate about 200 million of that goes to nutritious food in Africa for domestic consumption. For 54 countries in Africa, 200 million, that's 1,000th of the envelope, that's 0.1%. So we've set up with Incofin, who's our fund manager, a facility that's going to help potential investors find SMEs that can generate nutrition outcomes and commercial returns. And we're helping those businesses get investor ready with TA, and we're helping both of the investors and the businesses make sure that their work, their partnership generates nutrition outcomes. So I need help, Atlanti, in making that happen sooner rather than later. But that's the dream. And if we can get that, it's starting out as a $60 million fund. If we can get that up to $1 billion or 10 billion, I will be a very happy person. More importantly, lots of consumers of nutritious food in Africa will be happy because they can get their food at a lower price than they can currently afford. We will attack that 3 billion number that I mentioned right at the beginning.
Lawrence, is there any way that people could get in touch with you to learn more about this?
Please email me at
okay.
lhaddad@gainhealth.org.
Okay,
yes.
perfect. Paul, we'll end with you with your dream.
Not to give you other ideas to channel your energy and funds to, because Lawrence needs support, so I would fully endorse that. Obviously, the dream is embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals of how do you create a more sustainable and equitable society where nobody is left behind, and do that for generations to come. And that's really what the SDGs are also. We can talk about education for women or inclusion in the workforce and all the other things. But at the end of the day, I do believe that we have all the solutions that are needed more or less to attack the world's problems, but that the biggest thing that we need to address is the apathy that is there and move to empathy. So I would say that my dream would be a world where the balance of sensitivity is restored. In fact, we should, in my opinion, all dream of such a place. And right now, sometimes you wonder if we live in this world, as you see adults behave like children and children behave like adults. You know, we're seeing the scores of insensitivity prevailing today in many things. And it's not only in politics, it has crept in the private sector as well, and frankly also in many parts of the public sector. And we see the cost of it. It's devastating, devastating to our mental health. Our personal and collective values are being challenged, and our ability as a species to maintain a climate and environment that actually has an interest in sustaining our existence is in question. So in a sense, my dream is to get a world back where people do care, where we do work in global cooperation, and where we put the interests of others ahead of our own, knowing that by doing so, we're all better off ourselves as well.
I think you make a very good point. And I think when you talked about the founder of Unilever and that the company was founded on a set of values, that's what all companies in the past were set on. Values were what drove them. I know from my own family, when they set up their businesses in the 19th century, it was based on values. And now we've forgotten that. And I think that's such a central point, because it really touches so many things. Before you go, we have, do we have time for a couple of questions or not? Do we have any questions? I didn't see. Non-specific. No, non-specific. So we have one here, which I'm going to read from Anna Galan. She says, all ingredients are there to tackle malnutrition and beyond, to collaborate to create a sustainable food system. That's not a question, though.
I mean, the person asking the question is right, but we have to be monomaniacs on a mission to make it work. You have to have that drive of purpose. As Paul said, don't give up, keep going, be determined, win each day at a time. And over the years, incredible things will happen. Yeah,
I really believe that. Thank you both so much.
Atalanta, is there not time for one question?
Yes, sorry. Yes, please do. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hearing you talk, it's so obvious. All of us on this Zoom are behind. We're wanting to get involved. And my question to both of you is, can you give us any understanding of the other side, the people who are not seeing what is going on? So have you got any insight into their mindset? And do either of you have a subject matter or a way of introduction that you have found can open the conversation with, I'm calling them the other, because one really feels there's such a divide. Any tips on how to open the conversation with people who are not of like mind?
Well, you want me to kick it off, Lawrence, or you want to start?
Go ahead, Paul.
No, I think there are some things that I don't think we have to talk about, but in any change that is there, the problem that we currently see is that we are trying to make incremental changes within a current system that is not working. And anytime that you do that, the system pushes back. Right now, we're playing not to lose instead of playing to win. Private sector, very careful, government's very careful. So it is in leadership, courageous leadership, people that don't mind feeling uncomfortable, but know that they need to go for things that are simply right. Because if you work in a system of not to lose instead of to win, you get incrementalism. And that's why the speed and scale of the changes that we need to make, we might be going in the right direction, but it's not enough. So one of the biggest things you have to be mindful of is that there is a vested order in anything where people have a self-interest in the status quo. And that is in climate change, that is in our economic value creation, and distribution, etc. But I do believe that the bulk of people are good. So why aren't we collectively able to do that? Two reasons for that. First one is we react to the boundaries in which we operate. For example, if I have a salesman and I reward them on customer service, they're going to behave differently than if I would reward them on the number of orders they write. So we behave in the boundaries that we operate in. So if we don't change these boundaries, move the financial markets to the longer term, start changing our accounting systems, it is very difficult to change people's behavior. Point number one. Point number two, very quickly, is that there are some human behaviors that we are all suffering from. The first one is we like instant gratification and we don't appreciate things that are more longer term. It's the dopamine in our brains. So as a result of that, we deal with issues here and now with urgency, like the COVID crisis. But climate change that creeps up on us is not being treated with the level of seriousness that we all need individually and collectively. The second one with human beings is very simple, that we have a hard time thinking exponential. That's also, by the way, why in COVID, we didn't understand this exponential growth that people were talking about. We are basically thinking linear, and that doesn't help either. And the third thing with human beings is we think we're such a small part in such a big system. There are nearly 8 billion of us, so I can't make a difference. And that it's easier than to abdicate your responsibilities, because whatever I do, my neighbor still drives out of the driveway in an SUV and smokes a cigarette that he pulls on my lawn. So collectively, we need to muster that courage. We need to drive these systems changes that we talk about. And individually, we also need to get in another frame of mind. These are not unovercomable obstacles, by the way, and you don't need the whole world to be behind you. In any change effort, once more, as I mentioned before, you just need to get the right people in. And I believe that's actually often only 30 people that represent that right group that can create tipping points. And so getting these people together and driving these tipping points is probably the way that we need to go. But at the end of the day, it boils down to leadership.
Yeah, can I jump in, Atlanti?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Leadership is absolutely key, and being uncomfortable is a state, I think, of bold leadership. I've got two things to add really to what Paul said. The first is, and it's a great question. First thing, I don't think we actually talk to people who disagree with us enough. Yeah. We don't spend enough time sort of understanding where they're coming from. We tend to, and I fight very hard against this, we tend to talk to people who think like we do. And people who disagree with us or people we don't like, we tend to avoid them. We have the luxury of doing that. We must simply resist that. And we must simply really understand other people's points of view, because they're not bad people. We just need to understand their perspective. And I think the second thing is, you connect with head, but you also connect with heart and with gut. And I never forget, there was a very senior, sort of the top civil servant in one of the governments that I was trying to get them to spend more time and money and energy and strategy thinking about what to do about malnutrition rates, which they had were through the roof. And I couldn't get them to, I was barraging them with data, with numbers, with benefit cost ratios. It just wasn't working. And then I'm sitting in the guy's room in his office one day, and he says to me, "Now tell me about breastfeeding." And I've been trying to get him to pay attention to exclusive breastfeeding in the first 4 months of life for the last 5 years. And I nearly fell off my chair, and I said, why? He said, "Well, my daughter's just given birth." So, you have to try and relate to people as human beings. We've all got our blind spots. We've all got our vulnerabilities. We've all got our human sides. And you have to try to convince people with head, heart, and gut.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. So any other questions before I cut somebody off again? No? I'd like to say this has gone beyond my expectations. We touch such sort of core issues and which really are so important to even the work that I'm doing. And I really do believe that everybody can make a difference. My mantra used to be, I believe in the power of one, and I truly do believe in the power of one. But everything that I've heard here today, my new mantra is, which was actually given to me by my daughter Eliana, who's sitting right here, that I believe in the power of one, but in the magic of many. And I think that one of the things that I feel that people like yourselves. It's the example. Sometimes we don't have chance to speak to people, but we do touch people in a way that we can't imagine by what we're doing. So thank you for being who you are. Thank you for giving us your time. And we're here to work together and make magic. Thank you all so much.